This was played March 24th, 1959. His opponent, Luis Augusto Sanchez. Luis Augusto Sanchez Montenegro was born July 20th, 1917, passed away April 20th, 1982, age of 64. And he broke onto the international stage of chess in 1938 by winning the chess tournament at the first Bolivarian Games in Bogota. In 1951, he took first place at Caracas, which was a zonal tournament and was therefore awarded the International Master title. And Sanchez is a six-time Colombian chess champion, 1938, 47, 48, 54, 58, and 62. Well, he goes for Retti's opening here, which, as you probably know, is named for Richard Reti. Reti lived from 1889 to 1929. He was Austro-Hungarian, later became Czechoslovakian. Not only was he a strong chess player, but Reti was an author and composer of endgame studies. And like Nimzovich, we mentioned in the previous game, because it started out as Nimzovich's defense, like Nimzovich, Reti was one of the principal proponents of hypermodernism. In fact, with the exception of Nimzovich and the book My System, Reti would be one of the foremost literary contributors to the hypermodernistic movement. All right, so Retti's opening, and the idea of Retti's opening is to play a flexible opening without tipping your hand. Retti's opening will transpose to an English, a queen's pawn opening, a king's pawn opening. You'll remember when Bobby was younger, he often turned the Retti's opening into a king's Indian attack. Most frequently, Retti's does not stay a pure Retti's opening. It more frequently transposes to something else. So after knight f6, d4, g6, this is already an East Indian setup, and we're not really surprised to see c4 here, transposing to the king's Indian defense. And of course, we get a normal variation after bishop g7 and knight to c3. Black castles, pawn e4, pawn d6. Now bishop e2. This is the orthodox variation. Pawn e5. Pawn d5 is Petrosian's variation. And I trust you know the name Tigran Petrosian. Don't confuse him with the cheater that got exposed a few years ago, whose name was also Tigran Petrosian. Tigran L. Petrosian was the cheater. This is Tigran Vartanovich Petrosian, who lived from June 1929 to August 1984, who was world champion from 1963 to 1969. But when we play Queen's Knight to d7, we transpose again to Averbach's variation. And you probably also familiar with the name Yuri Averbach, who lived from 1922 to 2022. He only died a couple of years ago at the age of 100. A very famous grandmaster who was the first centenarian grandmaster on record, by the way. But even to his 100th year, he was involved in chess-related activities. Yuri Averbach and Averbach's variation. Now bishop g5 is played, pinning the knight, and h6 hits the bishop. Bishop h4 maintains the pin on the knight. And here Bobby goes out of book with a6. G5 is the usual move. You don't want that pin to remain in place. And after bishop g3, the knight comes to h5. And white will play h4. G4 hits this knight. The most common reply here is knight h2, getting a super attack and battery attack aiming at that g-man. The way black resolves this threat is by taking the bishop with a counterattack on this rook, and after pawn takes the knight, pawn h5 secures the g-man. White will castle, and then black typically gets his bishop onto this nice long diagonal. Not the long diagonal, but a nice long active diagonal, looking particularly at the e3 square. Coming back, Bobby not going that route in this game, plays a6. Sanchez castles. Yeah, knight d2. Opening this diagonal is still quite a potentially strong move, and maybe, since I haven't castled yet, maybe I'll play pawn to g4. That's got to be what the bot has in mind, if bots have a mind. After white castled, we have queen e8 breaking this pin. Knight e1, and we already mentioned the benefit of knight d2. Well, knight d2 has an added benefit besides this discovery, because this still opens this diagonal, but the added benefit is this knight is closer to the center and supporting the center. Knight e1 was Sanchez's choice. Bobby with knight h7, right. Well, I thought knight c5 would have been interesting here. The bot calling for the g-man to push forward yet. That's always going to be a move. But what about knight c5 super attacking this pawn? I get a thumbs up on that. The point here of this is you're really telling him why he should have played that knight to d2 after all. Interesting that the bot says you can go ahead and take this right away. But now it says it's inaccurate. Make up your mind, fickle bot. Make up your mind. Right? g5 is the most direct move here. Push that bishop back to g3. And then I can take this pawn. And I'm going to show you why. After you take my knight, I'll hit your knight. And if you save your knight, your bishop is trapped. Right? So knight d2, bada bing, bada boom, I'm getting my material back. That's actually quite a fun way to play, isn't it? Let's go back. Knight h7 was played by Bobby Fischer. Pawn f3 gives his bishop a nice square to go to, although this diagonal really isn't all that great. Notice the control black exerts along that diagonal. But f5 now, knight d3, f4 here, exerting more pressure on this diagonal. So f2 is not going to be the best square for that bishop after all, it looks like. Strong move. Perhaps you could have played the queen's knight here as well and brought more pieces over this way. It gets a star. I don't think knight g5 would be as good because, right, but f4 it was. b4, well, the bot says do take up residence on that diagonal. g5 here pushes the bishop back to f2, which now Ficklebot says is not the best move. Again, all of these squares controlled by black, so the bot says this diagonal has more promise for the bishop. Eventually, a more hopeful future. Anyway, bishop f2, now h5. Right, a big red X there. The point of h5 is to support the pawn push to g4. But as you can see, knight d f6 also supports a pawn push to g4 and improves the knight and opens this path for the bishop, which I presume is the reason the bot says that's more betterer. Bad English, but good chess right there. Well, h5 was played, c5, queen g6, rook c1. That gets an inaccuracy. The bot saying, let's get this party moving, bust things up. You should also note that since there's no f-pawn on f2, king h1 can be played almost at any point, so this has got to be a good option. Rook c1 from Sanchez. Now the queen's knight comes to f6, and now it is not liked. Well, you know, he's adding additional support. I think you can go ahead and play g4 right here. No surprise, Ficklebot says Bobby's move. As soon as I say play g4 right away, Ficklebot says, no, bring in another defender. But when Bobby played that move, the Ficklebot says, no, that's a terrible move. King h1 is played here, and there's not going to be much of a bad time to play that. Maybe he could still defer this move with this move. Oh, no, my mistake. I was thinking maybe he could break open this file, and then knight a4 really brings pressure. I don't understand this bot yelling at me. Right. b5 is an interesting move as well, but the bot doesn't like that one either. Coming back, knight d f6 was played. King h1 was played. Pawn g4 is finally played. Bishop h4. Bishop h6. Bishop d7 is also a playable move here, with the idea of connecting the rooks and making white tip his hand. Oh, I guess I'm inaccurate after all. Oh, it changed its mind and gave me a check mark. You can also play knight g5. I guess not, unless it changes. It didn't change its mind on that one. It's funny, though, when I played this, the bot does confirm bishop d7 as supposedly the best move, but when I play this, it says it's not the best move. Anyway, bishop to h6 was played and does get a star. C takes the demand. And I still like the idea of b5 here myself, but perhaps it's not a good idea to open this file. I do get a thumbs up. Anyway, c takes d6, c takes d6. Now knight a4 is played, and that's coming here to b6. The big issue here is the rook's control of the open c file. Bishop g5 wants to know what you're going to do with this. And of course, we're going to open things up here if given the opportunity. Queen e1, a fairly thematic move in these f-pawn openings, but here it gets marked as a mistake. Go ahead and play the knight b6 and attack the rook here. And really, the knight often comes to b6 to facilitate its transfer to c4. So the way you get your knight from c3 to c4 is bring it to the rim, which initially looks dim, but then gain tempo on the rook, and then go to c4. Rook b8 is played to avoid the tempo, but now he plays knight b6. Knight d7 interrogates the counterpart, right? Better is pawn takes the pawn here. On pawn takes the pawn, and pawn takes the pawn. We have knight takes the... Oh, it gave me a double exclam, then changed it. Don't tease me like that. How do you start me out at a double exclam and then change your mind? Well, my point is this. After takes, queen takes with check. And you can either block with your bishop or block with your rook. But if you block with your bishop, you're losing your knight. And if you block with your rook, if you block with your rook, that's going to be bishop here. So you can't block with your rook. You have to block with the bishop and give up the knight. And that was my point of knight takes the e-man, which is why I deserved the double exclam it initially gave me and then changed its mind. Another option here, of course, is to simply take that with the bishop. And maybe that's more prudent. I will take here. You'll take here. I think I'll still take the e-man, though, because your queen was overworked, right? Ah, it says wrong. All right, I can't please the fickle bot today. Well, Bobby went with knight d7, and knight c4, as predicted, put some pressure on this backward d-man. It's only defended by the queen. Now, rook takes bishop might be interesting here. I'm not... Oh, it changed it to a check mark. If knight takes knight, rook takes rook, and rook takes rook. Don't start this with knight takes, because that puts black on the open file in the end. But knight c4, a good move. Rook f6, getting a question mark. The b5 could be played here. It's a pretty strong threat, hitting the knight. I'm just wondering, can I just retreat my bishop to d8 here as well? No, I can't decide. Rook f6 was Bobby's play. Rook c2. Pawn takes pawn is quite a complex line, the move being called for by the bot. On pawn takes pawn, I pawn takes pawn, and if you bishop takes the pawn, can I... maybe I have to abandon that idea. Right. That's undefended, so knight b6. Knight b6 is a good move. I get a star. He could take the bishop here. Oh, that's a question mark. He says take here. My thought was if he trades bishops, I'd have to take here first, and then he could trade this bishops here. But not liking any of my ideas. But it did like my idea of opening this diagonal, which is what started this whole mess. All right, rook c2 from Sanchez. Here b5 is played, hitting the knight, knight a5, and right, he wants to come to this outpost on c6. Knight b6, inaccurate. I like knight b6. I was actually expecting him to trade bishops and then play knight b6. Oh, that's also inaccurate. Oh, it changed its mind and gave me a star. And after queen takes, then knight b6. Good, it changed its mind and gave me a star for bishop takes bishop. And maybe simpler is to just defend the 7th rank with rook f7 and see what it thinks of that. That also gets a star. But knight b6 right here. Bishop f2, bishop d7. Yeah, right. So the reason for bishop d7 is this rook is presently overworked. So the bot says play the knight to c4 to avoid overworking this bishop. And it puts the question to this knight here, doesn't it? But bishop d7, Bobby's choice, and rook c7. Right. My first instinct was to avoid knight c6, but it does attack the rook. Right? It attacks the rook, and it threatens to fork the king and the queen. So, in other words, that would force you to trade your bishop for his knight, and it gives white a passed pawn, doesn't it? Although I could block the defender of that passed pawn, and that's going to be a hard pawn to hang on to, isn't it? Which I guess my first instinct was correct when I said don't play the knight c6 line because it's going to be next to impossible to hang on to that passer. Well, but the bot says it's okay, so right. Rook c7 was played, rook f7 here. I'm surprised to see a question mark here. This is quite a strong defender along the 7th rank. Knight b2. Yeah, I was fully expecting bishop takes knight there. Bishop takes knight, rook takes the bishop, and then maybe queen f2 sends the rook back from whence it came. Knight b2 was played, and rook g7 here, getting a blunder? Why is that a blunder? Okay, bishop d8 was my choice. The bot wanting pawn to advance, but I thought, hey, let's get rid of this pain-in-the-neck rook. I get a star for my idea. And that also makes this square available to my crummy knight here, who wants to get back into the game. So, I mean, he can play rook b7 and offer a rook trade, but after bishop c7, I should be Jim Dandy, or at least Hakuna Matata. Coming back, rook g7. Hard to see that as a blunder, though. I mean, the eval bar dips slightly, but not much. How's that a blunder? Knight c6, bishop takes c6. I was expecting him to go ahead and offer that rook trade here on c8. Let's see what we get here. A star. Yeah, a good move. Instead, bishop takes the knight. Oh, and that's a mistake? Ooh, the eval bar starting to creep downward now. Rook takes the rook on g7, and that gives check. You want to resist taking this with your rook because then bishop d8 and everything's golden. So rook takes the rook with check, queen takes the rook, pawn takes the bishop on c6, knight to f6, right? Queen c7 seems preferable to put some heat on this passer. Queen c3 here, right? a4. The idea of a4 is to decoy the b-man, and that exposes this pawn to this bishop, right? So, for example, if I take, bishop takes the pawn here. That's the idea. Another note, with this undefended pawn, you might be tempted to play here, but that's a mistake because it's answered by queen c7, and that not only defends my pawn, but attacks his pawn and compels rook c1. Queen c3 was Sanchez's move, and queen c7. Wow, knight a8. What a difficult move to play for a human being, putting your knight in the corner. Obviously, the idea is to transfer to c7 with a nice blockade on this pawn. It also just puts a second attacker against that pawn coming forward. Well, queen c7 was played. Rook c1. That's also held in disdain. a4 still being called for with the same reason that I mentioned before. The point of a4 is to really focus on a6. Here Bobby plays h4. Queen b3 is check. King g7. Queen e6 infiltrating. Black under pressure. Did I mention, by the way, that a4 is a good way to try to decoy this pawn? Oh, now it's a mistake. Okay. Well, queen e6, g3, bishop g1, g takes h2, not liked. Bot calling for king h6. Well, I mean, I would have played knight to c8, I think, here with the idea of knight e7. I get a check mark. Anyway, the pawn takes the h-man, the king takes that pawn. White definitely better in this position. Remarkable. Now knight c8 is played, so the bot calling for h3. The idea of pushing the pawn here is to vacate the h4 square. And furthermore, it will open this line toward the enemy king. Right, so in other words, you surely can't take that with your queen, or you're lost. Knight c8, Bobby's choice. Bishop d1, knight e7, bishop b3, battery attacking along the a2 g8 diagonal. Knight g6 defends the f7 square by discovery. Knight d3. That was a sealed move, and the game did not continue. The players agreed to a draw, but white clearly in the driving seat here. The bot calling for bishop f2 here, my eyes were drawn to simply bringing the queen in to help, and I get a thumbs up there. But you can see the eval bar says that white is still clearly on top. So, not as pristine this game by either side. Competitive enough, decent opening, and fairly equal battle in the middle game, but a lot of inaccuracies by everybody, including Coach Daniel. And Sanchez comes away with a draw.